The note was only 7 words long, but it changed everything. Michael Harrison looked up from his dinner so suddenly that the conversation around him seemed to disappear. Crystal glasses still reflected the warm restaurant lights. Silverware still touched fine china somewhere in the distance. The soft jazz playing overhead had not stopped. Yet for Michael, the world had become strangely quiet. He read the note again. Then a third time. His fingers tightened slightly around the small folded piece of paper resting beside his plate. For a moment he simply stared at it, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They did not. Across the restaurant, a waitress was clearing another table with the same calm efficiency she always displayed. Grace Parker moved through the dining room without drawing attention to herself. Most customers barely noticed her. Michael had certainly never paid much attention. Not because he was rude. He simply lived in a world where people served him, advised him, invested with him, negotiated with him, and disappeared again. The waitress was just another face in the background. Until tonight. Michael glanced down at the note once more. The handwriting was neat. Deliberate. Personal. There was no signature. No explanation. Only a message that seemed impossible. His favorite meal sat untouched in front of him. That alone would have shocked anyone who knew him. For nearly 10 years, every Thursday evening followed the exact same pattern. Same restaurant. Same table near the window. Same meal. Same black coffee afterward. It was a routine so predictable that the staff often started preparing his order before he even arrived. Michael had built a multi-billion-dollar technology company by eliminating uncertainty wherever possible. Structure made sense. Routine made sense. Predictability made sense. The note did not. He slowly lifted his eyes and searched the dining room. Grace was speaking quietly with an elderly couple near the entrance. She smiled politely, thanked them, and then returned to collecting dishes. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just altered the course of someone's evening. Michael looked down again. 7 words. That was all it took. The strange thing was not that the message surprised him. It was that it touched a part of his life he rarely allowed himself to think about anymore. A part he had carefully organized into the past. Outside the restaurant window, rain tapped softly against the glass. New York traffic moved through reflections of red taillights and glowing storefronts. Michael barely noticed. His attention remained trapped by the folded note. Finally he pushed back his chair and stood. Several diners glanced over. Not because standing was unusual, but because Michael Harrison was known for being composed under every circumstance. Investors trusted him because he never seemed shaken. Journalists described him as disciplined. Competitors described him as impossible to read. Tonight was different. He crossed the restaurant floor toward Grace. She noticed him approaching but did not appear nervous. She simply waited. "Did you write this?" Michael asked quietly, holding up the note. Grace glanced at the paper and nodded once. Yes. Her answer was simple. No apology. No explanation. Michael studied her face. She looked sincere. Calm. Certain. "How do you know this?" he asked. Grace looked toward the empty table where he had been sitting only moments earlier. Then she met his eyes again. Because someone left something behind. Michael felt a strange sensation settle in his chest. Confusion mixed with curiosity. What does that mean? Grace was silent for a moment. Not evasive. Thoughtful. Then she said, "It means the note is only the beginning." Around them, the restaurant continued its evening routine. Orders were delivered. Glasses were refilled. Guests laughed quietly over dinner. Yet Michael no longer felt connected to any of it. For the first time in years, something had interrupted the carefully controlled rhythm of his life. Not a business crisis. Not a market collapse. Not a lawsuit or a merger. A note. A simple folded note slipped beneath a dinner plate by a waitress most people never noticed. And somehow, deep inside, Michael already knew he was not going to walk away from whatever came next. Michael Harrison stood motionless for a moment after Grace spoke, the folded note still resting in his hand as rain traced thin lines down the restaurant window behind him. The phrase echoed in his mind with unusual persistence. The note is only the beginning. Most people would have dismissed a statement like that as a dramatic attempt to get attention. But nothing about Grace Parker felt dramatic. She had not approached his table seeking recognition. She had not interrupted his dinner. She had not even remained nearby to watch his reaction. If anything, she seemed almost reluctant to be part of whatever was happening. Someone left something behind? Michael repeated quietly. Grace nodded. A long time ago. Her voice remained calm. I think it belongs to you. Michael studied her expression carefully, searching for signs of exaggeration or manipulation. Years of negotiations had taught him how to recognize hidden motives. Investors wanted leverage. Competitors wanted advantage. Reporters wanted headlines. Grace appeared to want none of those things. That made her harder to read. What exactly was left behind, he asked. Grace glanced toward a hallway leading away from the main dining room. Not here, she said. I should finish my shift first. Under normal circumstances Michael would have walked away. His schedule was planned weeks in advance. Meetings began on time. Flights departed on time. His entire life operated according to calendars and priorities. Yet for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself returning to his table instead of leaving. His dinner remained untouched. The coffee he usually enjoyed after every Thursday meal sat cooling beside the plate. For the next 40 minutes he barely noticed either one. Instead, he watched the restaurant. Not the guests. Not the staff. Grace. She moved through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency he had never noticed before. She remembered orders without writing them down. She greeted regular customers by name. She helped a nervous young server carry a heavy tray without drawing attention to the gesture. The more Michael observed, the more he realized something strange. Grace seemed to notice everyone. Not in the superficial way customer service required. She paid attention. Genuine attention. As though people mattered beyond the transactions surrounding them. Eventually the evening crowd began to thin. Tables emptied. Conversations faded. Chairs were pushed neatly beneath polished wood surfaces. The restaurant transformed from a bustling dining room into a quieter space filled with reflections and soft light. Grace approached his table carrying a small ring of keys. You waited, she said. Michael gave a faint smile. Apparently. For the first time that evening, Grace smiled back. It was brief but sincere. Come with me. She led him through the hallway he had noticed earlier. They passed the kitchen entrance, storage shelves, and a narrow staircase leading toward a lower level. The sounds of the restaurant gradually disappeared behind them. At the end of a corridor stood an old storage room door. Grace unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was surprisingly organized. Boxes lined metal shelves. Old menus were stacked neatly in containers. Records from previous decades occupied labeled filing cabinets. It felt less like storage and more like a preserved memory. Grace walked toward a shelf near the back wall and stopped. For a moment she simply looked at something resting there. Then she carefully lifted a small wooden box. Dust covered the corners. The brass latch showed signs of age. Michael felt his pulse quicken slightly for reasons he did not understand. Grace carried the box toward him and held it with both hands. This was found years ago, she said softly. No one knew who it belonged to at first. Michael lowered his eyes to the worn surface. Then he saw it. Faded but still visible. A handwritten name across the lid. His father's name. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The storage room seemed impossibly still. Michael stared at the box as memories he had not revisited in years began rising quietly from somewhere deep inside him. And suddenly the note on his dinner plate no longer felt mysterious. It felt personal. Michael Harrison could not take his eyes off the wooden box. The faded handwriting on the lid felt impossible and familiar at the same time. For years he had avoided revisiting certain memories, convincing himself that the past was less important than the future he was building. Yet standing inside that quiet storage room, surrounded by forgotten objects and old records, he felt those carefully organized walls beginning to crack. Grace Parker remained silent beside him. She did not rush him. She did not explain. She simply allowed the moment to exist. Michael slowly reached forward and brushed a finger across the worn surface of the lid. Dust gathered against his skin. The box looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested it could contain anything powerful. But then again, neither had the note. "How long has this been here?" he asked quietly. Grace folded her hands in front of her. "At least 12 years. Michael looked up immediately. 12 years? She nodded. The restaurant changed ownership twice. Storage rooms were reorganized. Old records were moved. But nobody threw this away. Michael frowned. Why not? Grace glanced toward the label on the lid. Because every time someone suggested removing it, one of the older employees said the owner might come back someday. Something about that answer settled heavily in the room. Michael remembered his father as a man of routines. Consistent. Predictable. Loyal to places most people overlooked. The realization that his father may have sat in this same restaurant years ago felt strangely emotional. He swallowed and looked back at the box. You knew it belonged to him? Grace nodded carefully. Not at first. Michael waited. Grace continued. About 6 months ago I was organizing old reservation records. I noticed the same last name appearing again and again. She offered a small smile. Then one night I saw your reservation and recognized it immediately. Michael felt another wave of surprise. You connected it from a reservation list? Not immediately, Grace admitted. I spent weeks checking dates and records because I wanted to be certain. Michael stared at her. Few people devoted that level of effort to something with no obvious reward. Especially for a customer they barely knew. Why? He asked. Grace seemed almost surprised by the question. Because it felt important. The answer was simple. Honest. And somehow impossible to argue with. Silence settled between them again. Michael finally lifted the box. It felt heavier than expected. Not physically heavy. Meaningfully heavy. Like something carrying years inside it. The brass latch clicked softly as he touched it. His hand stopped. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt nervous. Not the nervousness of business presentations or financial risk. Something deeper. More personal. Grace noticed his hesitation. You do not have to open it tonight, she said gently. Michael looked down at the box resting in his hands. Then he slowly shook his head. I think I do. He released the latch. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet room. Then he lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly folded envelopes. Nothing else. No jewelry. No documents. No valuables. Just letters. Letter after letter after letter. Michael stared in disbelief. The envelopes were arranged carefully, almost respectfully, as though someone had taken great care preserving them. Most were yellowed slightly with age. Each one carried the same handwriting he remembered from childhood birthday cards and holiday notes. His father's handwriting. Michael felt his chest tighten. For several seconds he could not speak. He reached down and carefully picked up the first envelope resting on top. His name was written across the front. Michael Harrison. The sight of those two words in his father's handwriting stopped time. The storage room faded. The restaurant faded. Even the sound of rain outside seemed distant now. All that remained was a single envelope and a lifetime of questions he had never expected to ask again. Grace remained quietly beside him. She did not interrupt. She did not explain. Because somehow she understood what Michael was only beginning to realize. Whatever was inside those letters was not a discovery about money. It was a discovery about a relationship he thought had ended years ago. And deep down, before opening even the first envelope, Michael already sensed that his life was about to change in a way no business deal ever had. Michael Harrison stood in the storage room holding the envelope as though it were made of something far more fragile than paper. The handwriting alone was enough to pull him backward through years he had carefully packed away beneath board meetings and quarterly reports. He slowly slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it. The paper inside was folded neatly. For a moment he simply stared at it. Then he began to read. The first line stopped him immediately. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was ordinary. His father had written about a Thursday evening. About sitting near the restaurant window. About ordering the same meal every week. About watching people hurry through life while wondering if his son was doing the same. Michael blinked and read the sentence again. It felt strange. His father had never spoken that way when he was alive. Their conversations had often been brief. Practical. Focused on responsibilities rather than emotions. Yet here on the page was a version of the man he barely recognized. Honest. Thoughtful. Almost vulnerable. The storage room seemed smaller now. Quieter. Grace Parker remained nearby but respectfully distant, giving him space without leaving entirely. Michael continued reading. His father described the city lights outside the restaurant. He described memories of teaching Michael how to ride a bicycle. He described being proud of the young man his son had become. The words were simple. Nothing extraordinary. Yet Michael felt something tightening in his chest with every paragraph. He had spent years assuming his father struggled to express affection. Reading the letter, he began to suspect the problem had never been a lack of feeling. It had been a lack of timing. When he reached the final line, he lowered the page slowly. The room was silent. There are dozens of them, Grace said softly. Michael looked down into the box. She was right. There were dozens. Maybe more. Each envelope carried a date. Each one addressed to him. Did he write all of these here? Michael asked. Grace nodded. According to some of the older staff, he came almost every Thursday for years. Michael stared at the letters. The realization felt overwhelming. While he had been building companies and traveling across the world, his father had apparently been sitting in this restaurant writing letters no one was meant to read immediately. He picked up a second envelope. Then a third. Different dates. Different years. The same careful handwriting. The same name on the front. His name. Michael sat down on a nearby chair because suddenly standing felt difficult. He looked at Grace. Why did nobody contact me? Grace hesitated before answering. No one knew these existed. She glanced toward the box. The letters were sealed. The box stayed in storage. Most people assumed it contained old records. Michael lowered his eyes again. For years the box had sat only a few hundred feet from the table where he ate dinner every Thursday. The thought felt almost impossible. Grace watched him quietly. Then she spoke. There is something else. Michael looked up. What? Grace folded her hands together. The last employee who remembered your father retired 3 years ago. She paused. Before she left, she told me that if anyone ever came asking about the box, I should make sure they received it personally. Michael frowned slightly. She said that? Grace nodded. She said your father cared about timing. The word settled over him. Timing. He thought about his own life. The endless meetings. The delayed phone calls. The promises to reconnect with people later. The assumption that there would always be another opportunity. He looked down at the letter in his hands. Suddenly the pages felt less like messages from the past and more like conversations waiting patiently across time. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the building. Somewhere above them, staff members finished closing the restaurant. Yet inside the storage room, time seemed to move differently. Michael carefully placed the first letter back into its envelope and looked at the dozens still waiting inside the box. For the first time in years, he felt no desire to check his phone, no urge to return to work, no concern about tomorrow's schedule. There was only one thing he wanted to know. What else his father had been trying to say all these years. Michael Harrison remained seated in the storage room long after he finished reading the first letter. The envelope rested in his lap while dozens of others waited silently inside the wooden box. For years he had measured value through numbers, acquisitions, and growth charts. Yet nothing he had built seemed capable of competing with a single handwritten page from a man who was no longer alive. Grace Parker stood near one of the shelves, giving him the space to process what he was feeling. She understood that some discoveries required silence more than conversation. Michael slowly reached into the box and selected another envelope. The date written on the front was from nearly 9 years earlier. He opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. This one was different. His father wrote about failure. Not financial failure. Personal failure. He described moments when he wanted to call his son but convinced himself Michael was too busy. He described driving past Michael's office building and deciding not to stop because he did not want to interrupt an important day. The letter contained no blame. No bitterness. Only honesty. Michael found himself reading more slowly than before. Every sentence seemed to challenge assumptions he had carried for years. Growing up, he had often believed his father was distant because he did not care enough to reach out. The letter suggested something entirely different. A man who cared deeply but constantly worried about becoming a burden. Michael lowered the page and stared into the distance. How many misunderstandings survive simply because neither person says what they actually feel? The thought lingered. Grace quietly stepped closer. Most people think the letters are about the person who wrote them, she said softly. Michael looked up. What do you mean? She glanced at the envelope in his hand. Sometimes they are really about the person reading them. Michael considered that. Then he looked down again and reached for another letter. The next one carried a date from 7 years earlier. Then another from 6 years earlier. The room gradually disappeared around him as he moved through page after page. Some letters were only a few paragraphs. Others stretched several pages. None contained financial advice. None discussed investments. None mentioned inheritance. Instead, they described ordinary things. Memories. Regrets. Small victories. Observations about life. One letter described a Little League baseball game Michael had played as a child. Another recalled a family road trip that Michael barely remembered. One particularly short letter simply listed 10 things his father admired about him. Michael read that one twice. Then a third time. The words felt almost impossible to accept. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were genuine. Somewhere above them, a chair scraped softly across the restaurant floor as the last employees finished closing. The sound barely registered. Time had become strange. Michael had no idea how long he had been sitting there. His phone remained silent in his pocket. He had not checked it once. That alone would have surprised his executive assistant more than any headline ever could. Eventually he came across an envelope that looked different from the others. The paper was newer. The handwriting appeared slightly less steady. Michael opened it carefully. As he began reading, his expression changed. This letter had been written only a few months before his father's passing. The tone remained warm, but there was something else beneath the words now. Awareness. His father seemed to know time was becoming limited. He wrote about gratitude. About missed opportunities. About hope. Then Michael reached a sentence that made him stop completely. His father wrote that if his son ever found these letters, it would probably be because a kind stranger had decided they mattered enough to save. Michael slowly lowered the page. The words echoed through the room. A kind stranger. He turned toward Grace. She looked genuinely confused by his expression. "What is it?" she asked. Michael held up the letter. For several seconds he could not answer. Because suddenly the entire evening looked different. The note. The box. The years of preservation. The effort she had invested without expecting anything in return. His father had never known Grace Parker. Yet somehow, years earlier, he had described exactly the kind of person she would become. And for the first time that night, Michael began to realize that the most remarkable part of the story might not be the letters at all. Michael Harrison kept staring at the letter long after he finished reading the sentence. A kind stranger. The words seemed almost impossible. His father had written them years before Grace Parker ever discovered the box. Years before she connected his last name to old reservation records. Years before she slipped a folded note beneath a dinner plate. Yet somehow the description fit perfectly. Michael slowly lowered the page and looked across the storage room. Grace stood beside a shelf of archived records, unaware of the significance she now carried inside the story unfolding around him. She looked exactly as she had earlier that evening. Calm. Practical. Unassuming. Nothing about her suggested she had changed the course of another person's life. And perhaps that was precisely why she had. "Grace," Michael said quietly. She looked up. "Yes." He held the letter in his hand. "Do you realize how much effort you put into this?" She seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Not really." Michael gave a faint laugh. "It was the first one of the evening. You spent months connecting records. You preserved something nobody asked you to preserve. You tracked down a customer because you thought it mattered." Grace shrugged slightly. It did matter. Her answer arrived so naturally that Michael found himself smiling despite everything he was feeling. In his world, people usually justified actions with metrics, profits, incentives, or outcomes. Grace seemed to operate from a different system entirely. One built around simple human significance. Michael looked back at the box. "Most people would not have done what you did." Grace leaned lightly against a nearby shelf. "Maybe." Then she paused. "But most people never knew your father." Michael lifted his eyes. "You knew him?" Grace nodded. "Not well. I was younger when he came here. Still new at the restaurant." Her expression softened slightly. "He always sat near the window." Michael felt another memory forming. The window. The same table. The same routine he had unknowingly inherited. Grace continued. "He ordered almost the same thing every visit." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "Just like me." Grace smiled. "Exactly like you." For a moment neither of them spoke. The realization settled quietly between them. Michael had spent years believing he created his Thursday ritual because it helped him escape stress. Now he wondered whether some deeper part of him had simply been following a familiar path without realizing it. He looked around the storage room. The old shelves. The archived records. The wooden box. It all felt strangely connected now, as though invisible threads had been linking moments together long before he noticed them. He reached for another letter. This one carried a date from 5 years before his father's passing. As he unfolded it, something slipped out from between the pages and drifted gently onto his lap. Michael looked down. It was a photograph. Small. Slightly faded. He picked it up carefully. The image showed a much younger version of himself sitting beside his father at a county fair. Both of them were smiling. Neither looking at the camera. Michael stared at the picture. He did not even remember it being taken. Grace stepped closer and glanced at the photograph. There are more. Michael looked up. More photographs. Grace nodded toward the bottom of the box. I only looked once. Years ago. Michael carefully placed the picture beside the letters and reached deeper into the box. Beneath the envelopes rested a bundle secured with a thin ribbon. Inside were dozens of photographs. Family vacations. Birthday celebrations. Ordinary afternoons. Tiny moments preserved for reasons nobody could fully explain at the time. Michael felt his throat tighten. He realized something then. Success had given him access to almost anything money could buy. Yet none of it compared to discovering forgotten proof that someone had loved him all along. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The building settled into late-night silence. The restaurant above was now completely empty. Yet neither Michael nor Grace seemed eager to leave. Because somewhere between a dinner plate, a handwritten note, and a forgotten wooden box, the evening had become about something far larger than either of them expected. And Michael was beginning to understand that the most valuable inheritance in front of him was not hidden inside the letters or photographs. It was hidden inside the perspective they were giving him. Michael Harrison sat quietly with the photographs spread across the small table beside him, each image revealing a version of life he had not looked at in years. The storage room felt less like a forgotten corner of a restaurant now and more like a place where time had been patiently waiting. Across from him, Grace Parker watched without interruption. She understood that some discoveries arrived slowly, one memory at a time. Michael picked up another photograph. In it, he and his father were standing beside a fishing dock during a summer vacation. The picture was imperfect. Slightly blurry. The horizon tilted. Yet the smile on his father's face was unmistakable. Michael realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years remembering what his father failed to say. The letters and photographs were forcing him to remember everything his father actually did. The distinction mattered more than he expected. He lowered the photograph and reached for another letter. This one was thicker than the others. Several folded pages rested inside. As he unfolded them, a smaller piece of paper slipped free and landed gently beside the envelope. Michael picked it up. It was a restaurant receipt. Old. Faded. Nearly impossible to read. But one detail remained visible. The date. Michael stared at it. It was the same date as his college graduation. He remembered that day clearly. At least he thought he did. In his memory, his father had left early and barely spoken afterward. It had always felt like a disappointment. Michael began reading the letter. Halfway through the first page, he stopped. Then he started again from the beginning. The words reshaped the memory entirely. His father described sitting alone in this restaurant after the ceremony. He wrote about feeling proud. Overwhelmed. Emotional. He admitted that he had left quickly because he was afraid he would embarrass his son by becoming too sentimental in public. Michael closed his eyes briefly. For years he had interpreted that day as indifference. The letter revealed something entirely different. Not indifference. Insecurity. A father uncertain how to express love in a way his son would understand. Michael slowly exhaled and looked around the room. How many other memories had he misunderstood? The question stayed with him. Grace noticed his expression. Another surprise, she asked gently. Michael nodded. I spent years believing a story that was not true. Grace seemed to understand immediately. Most people do. Michael looked down at the receipt resting beside the letter. The restaurant had become something unexpected. Not just a building. A witness. A place where invisible pieces of his family's story had quietly remained when everything else moved forward. He glanced at Grace. What made you keep searching after you found the box? Grace considered the question carefully. Because I kept thinking about someone eventually opening it. Michael listened. Grace continued. I imagined what it would feel like if something important belonged to my family and nobody ever bothered to return it. Her voice remained calm, but there was emotion beneath it now. That thought stayed with me. Michael looked at her for several seconds. He had spent much of his life surrounded by people pursuing opportunity. Advancement. Recognition. Yet the reason Grace had protected the box was remarkably simple. Empathy. She imagined someone else's loss and decided it mattered. The realization struck him harder than any lesson contained in the letters. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the storm had completely passed. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued moving through the night. Yet inside the storage room, Michael felt as though he had stepped outside his normal life entirely. He looked at the box. Then at the letters. Then at Grace. A strange thought entered his mind. If she had never paid attention to an old reservation list. If she had never cared enough to investigate. If she had simply ignored the box the way countless others had. None of this would have happened. The photographs would still be hidden. The letters would still be unread. The conversations he was finally having with his father would never have begun. Michael lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. You know, most people would call this luck. Grace smiled faintly. And you? Michael looked around the room filled with preserved memories and second chances. Then he shook his head. I think it was kindness. Michael Harrison sat quietly as the words lingered between them. I think it was kindness. The statement settled into the room with a weight that surprised him. For most of his life, success had been explained through strategy, timing, discipline, and effort. Kindness rarely appeared on the list. Yet the more he looked around the storage room, the more difficult it became to deny its role in everything that had happened. The letters existed because his father had cared enough to write them. The box survived because strangers had cared enough not to discard it. And tonight had unfolded because one waitress had cared enough to pay attention. Michael looked down at the collection of photographs spread across the table. Each image felt less like a memory now and more like evidence. Evidence that important things often survive through ordinary acts that nobody notices at the time. Grace Parker quietly gathered a few of the photographs into a neat stack. You should take all of this home, she said. Michael nodded but did not immediately move. Home. The word felt different tonight. For years his penthouse apartment had been little more than a place to sleep between obligations. Suddenly he found himself imagining those letters resting on a table instead of inside a forgotten box. He imagined reading them slowly rather than all at once. He imagined giving himself permission to sit still long enough to absorb them. The thought felt unfamiliar. Yet strangely comforting. Grace glanced toward the hallway leading back to the restaurant. It is getting late. Michael looked at his watch for the first time all evening. He blinked in surprise. More than 3 hours had passed. 3 hours that felt both endless and impossibly brief. Normally he would have attended 2 meetings, answered dozens of emails, and reviewed several reports in that amount of time. Tonight he had done none of those things. And somehow the evening felt more valuable than entire weeks of work. He carefully placed the letters back into the box, leaving one envelope outside. The final envelope. It rested at the very bottom when he first opened the box. Different from the others. Sealed with darker paper. Dated only a few weeks before his father's passing. Michael had noticed it earlier but deliberately avoided opening it. Some part of him was not ready. Now the room felt quiet enough. He picked it up slowly. Grace noticed. The last one? Michael nodded. I think so. Neither of them spoke as he opened the envelope. The paper inside unfolded easily despite the years. Michael began reading. The first paragraphs were simple. Reflections on age. Gratitude. Memories. Then his father's words became more personal. He wrote that life had taught him something important. People spend years chasing bigger opportunities while overlooking smaller moments that ultimately matter more. Michael continued reading. Every sentence seemed to arrive exactly when he needed it. Then he reached the final page. His eyes moved across the lines once. Then again. The room disappeared around him. His father wrote that if Michael was reading this letter someday, he hoped he would stop measuring his life only through achievements. He hoped he would notice people. Really notice them. The quiet ones. The overlooked ones. The people who make the world better without expecting applause. Michael lowered the page slowly. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he looked up at Grace. She stood exactly where she had been all evening. Calm. Unassuming. Patient. Suddenly the final letter felt less like a message from the past and more like an answer waiting in the present. His father had spent years trying to teach him something he never fully understood. And somehow, on an ordinary Thursday night, in a nearly empty restaurant, the lesson had finally arrived. Michael Harrison remained seated for a long moment after finishing the final letter. The paper rested quietly in his hands, but the words continued moving through his thoughts. Notice people. Really notice them. The quiet ones. The overlooked ones. The people who make the world better without expecting applause. He had spent years believing success was built by seeing opportunities before others did. Yet tonight he realized something different. Perhaps wisdom came from seeing people others overlooked. The storage room was completely silent now. The restaurant above had finished closing. The city beyond the walls continued its endless motion, but inside that small room time seemed suspended. Michael carefully folded the final letter and placed it back into its envelope. Then he looked at Grace Parker. She had not asked for recognition. She had not asked for money. She had not even asked for gratitude. She had simply done what she believed was right. The simplicity of that truth felt extraordinary. Michael slowly stood and closed the lid of the wooden box. For a moment his reflection appeared faintly in the brass latch. He looked older than he had when he entered the restaurant that evening. Not physically older. Different. As if some invisible weight had shifted. Thank you, he said quietly. Grace smiled. You are welcome. Michael shook his head slightly. No. I do not think you understand. Grace looked at him curiously. Michael glanced at the box. I thought you were giving me letters. His voice softened. But you gave me years I thought were gone. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Some moments did not need more words. Eventually they walked back through the hallway together. The storage room door closed behind them with a gentle click. When they entered the dining room, the contrast felt strange. The restaurant that had seemed ordinary only a few hours earlier now looked different. Every table carried history. Every chair carried stories. Michael looked toward the familiar window seat where he had spent countless Thursday evenings. For the first time, he imagined his father sitting there. Writing letters. Watching the rain. hoping someday his son would understand what mattered most. Grace walked him to the front entrance. Outside, the storm had completely passed. The streets glistened beneath the city lights. Reflections shimmered across the wet pavement like scattered pieces of memory. Michael held the wooden box carefully under one arm. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. "Can I ask you one more question?" Grace nodded. "Of course." Michael looked at her. "Why did you leave the note tonight?" Grace considered the question for a moment. Then she smiled. "Because every Thursday you sat at the same table." Michael listened. "And every Thursday I thought about the box." Her smile widened slightly. Tonight felt like the right time. Michael laughed softly. Not because the answer was surprising. Because somehow it was exactly the answer he expected. Timing. His father had believed in it. Grace had believed in it. And now, standing beneath the glow of the restaurant lights, Michael found himself believing in it too. He thanked her once more and stepped outside. The cool night air greeted him immediately. For several seconds he simply stood there holding the box and looking up at the clearing sky between the buildings. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Emails. Messages. Requests. Deadlines. For the first time in years, he ignored them. Instead, he opened his contacts and selected a number he had not called in far too long. His mother answered after the second ring. "Michael," she said, surprised. He smiled as he looked down at the box. "Hi, Mom." There was a brief silence. Then she heard something in his voice she had not heard for years. "Is everything all right?" Michael looked back through the restaurant window. Grace was turning off the final light near the dining room entrance. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think it finally is." The call continued as he walked slowly down the sidewalk carrying a wooden box filled with letters, photographs, memories, and second chances. And somewhere behind him, inside a restaurant most people would forget by morning, a waitress returned to her ordinary life completely unaware that the smallest gesture of her week had become the most important moment in someone else's. Because sometimes the people who change our lives do not arrive with power or recognition. Sometimes they arrive quietly, carrying nothing more than kindness, patience, and the courage to notice what everyone else missed.